YouTube audience. This is Joe coming to you from Nankin Hobby, and it is February. For the month of February, we've kind of been celebrating coming together in RC hobbies particularly, but really any hobby. And in fact, a couple of days ago was Valentine's Day, a holiday celebrating coming together and togetherness. And what better thing to showcase for this week's YouTube video than the process of coming together? And it kind of felt like we needed a sort of an educational video. We haven't done anything like that in quite a while. There's been a lot of products being released, and that's kind of been the focus. So today we are going to be soldering. So if you're not familiar with soldering, and if you're in the hobby, you maybe are somewhat familiar with soldering. You maybe know what it is, you maybe haven't done it before, in which case this video might help you. Or if you're new to the hobby or just never considered how your connectors get put on your batteries or on your speed control, maybe you don't know what it is at all. So soldering is the process by which two pieces of metal, oftentimes a bullet connector or some little tab on one of your electrical connectors, is soldered to wire. This can be used in other things. Brass is a common thing, like if you buy some of the K&S brass from us, a common way to adhere those things together is by soldering them. You're forming a very strong joint made out of metal as opposed to glue or something, worse. And that will conduct electricity, which is super nice for electronics. Now, if you're a hobbyist and also a plumber, you may find yourself soldering other things, but for most of us in the RC hobby in particular, we're going to be primarily focused on soldering connectors to batteries, or soldering, connectors to your speed control, or maybe soldering bullet connectors to your motor, things like that. So we're going to be doing a brief overview of the things that you need if you want to solder your own stuff rather than bringing it to us. The first thing that you'll need is a soldering iron. Now, these come in many forms. This here is the Track Power TK950. This one is a complete soldering station. This is what we use here in the store. We're soldering a lot. This comes with the iron itself. This power supply here has a knob on it, lets you adjust the temperature. This comes with the little stand, a couple of tips, and this little spot for a sponge here. You can see our sponge has seen better days. There's been a lot of use on this. We maybe need to replace our sponge. But this is for cleaning. That's super helpful. There is another version of this, the TK955, which is essentially the same thing, except it has a digital readout, so you can still adjust your temperature, but you can do it a little bit more precisely. I don't think it's super necessary for things like wire, but it is really nice to be able to very accurately adjust your temperature if you're doing more sensitive things. Or if you're not doing a lot of soldering at all, you can absolutely go with something a little bit cheaper. There are very basic soldering irons you can pick up in the $15 to $20 range. We have some options like that too. But if you're in the hobby, if you're choosing to start soldering yourself, it's probably going to be something you're, doing fairly often, so you might as well invest in something nice. The TK950 here runs $110 or so. The 955 is about $125. Another thing that is incredible to have, this is, even if you're not soldering, this is something to have on hand. This is, they call it a helping hand. It's basically just this little stand. Has these arms with alligator clips that are adjustable. This is great for holding wire. A lot of modelers use this, so you can find all kinds of uses for this. There's different variants of this. Some of them come with a magnifying glass attached. Some have bendable arms. Some have many more alligator clips and other attachments. There's a lot of variants of this, but this is kind of the most basic version. These are only a few bucks. You should probably have one of those. And solder is the last thing. Now, solder is... This particular kind of solder is a 60-40 rosin core solder. So solder is basically a metal with a relatively low melting point, somewhere, I want to say around 500 degrees or so, that will melt and fuse to the other metal you're working with a much higher melting point. So this can get hot without melting. And then when that resolidifies, you have a bond between your two pieces. There is also, this is called rosin core solder, so there's also a core to this that is made of something called rosin. that is going to, in most cases, at least for what we're doing, replace flux. That's something you might see if you're familiar with soldering in other applications. You might expect to have flux on the bench here. We don't really need that for most of what we're doing in RC. I've never particularly needed it, but that does have its uses in certain applications, particularly if you're soldering to very small things like circuit boards. The reason that you might use something like that is it's going to clean up some of the gunk that gets on things, and especially when you're working with very small stuff, that makes a much bigger difference. There's basically flux built into this, and for the stuff we're doing, that's perfectly fine. So those are the basic things that you're going to want to have. You can see I have a few other things here. I have some wire. This is just red because we're just using it for some demonstration purposes. Normally you would have wire on your battery or speed controller or whatever you're soldering to, or if you need wire, you're probably going to be using multiple colors. That way things don't get confusing. I'm going to be doing everything on red today rather than opening two packages. But if you need wire, we have this in black or red. This is a 12 gauge wire I'm using here. We have a variety of different gauges. You can pick some up. And I have some connectors. This is just kind of an assortment of common connectors you might see. So I have probably the most common connector that we do is a Traxxas connector. So this is a Traxxas female connector. This is their older non-ID style Traxxas connector. So if you're used to the relatively modern Traxxas batteries, they will have a similar-ish looking connector, but it's a little bit wider. That is their ID connector. There's usually a couple other wires coming off of it. That is exactly the same for all intents and purposes, at least for what we're talking about today. Those are actually backwards compatible, so if you were to look at the end when it's all soldered up, they're pretty much identical there, other than just on the edges here. And those have these little tabs that we solder to, and it pops in the housing. Another common connector is the IC3. These have largely replaced the EC3s, and the bigger variant of this, the IC5, has replaced the EC5. Those connectors used a bullet connector that then popped into a housing. So we'll be doing a bullet today also, just to give you an idea for how you do that. Bullets are used not only in the EC3s and EC5s, but in a variety of things. Your motors will often have bullet connectors. The IC3s and IC5s now have that just kind of built in, and these are a little bit easier to solder to. Another common connector that we won't be doing today is Dean's. I figured we could kind of skip that and save some time because the IC3s are exceptionally similar to Dean's in how they're soldered. So the first things we want to do is get all of our stuff ready. We're going to turn on our iron. There's a switch here. I'm going to set my dial here. It's already set. We've used this as our store iron. If you get one out of the box and it's not set correctly, anywhere in the, say, like, it depends on which store I'm working at. A lot of times the guys will just have it cranked all the way to the max. I kind of like it at around 850. It's not so hot. That's what they had it here at the Southgate store. I think that's kind of perfect. That's how we're going to have this set. This will take a few minutes to heat up. You're going to want to open up everything that you're doing, get everything off of the vehicle, everything kind of situated. And we'll skip to this being hot. So the iron is hot now. I have taken and cut my wire into small pieces, and we probably wouldn't normally be working with pieces of wire this small, but this is just for demonstration purposes, so I thought I'd get as much out of that piece as I could. And now I have plenty of leftover for the next project. So when I was talking about what we would need, one thing I did not mention was a pair of wire cutters and or wire strippers. Sometimes your wire strippers will have a cutter built into them. This one has seen better days, so I also have a pair of cutters here, just some side cuts. That works just fine. First thing we're going to do is bare a little bit of the wire on the end we're going to solder to. Usually you want to go about the diameter of the wire. That's about what you want stripped there, so that much off the end, and depending on what you're doing, you might want to do both sides. Actually, I don't think I needed to on that piece for this. We'll probably be using a separate piece of wire for each of these, just because we have it. But I'll still strip them all, because why not? And you don't have to be perfect. One's a little bit longer, it's not a big deal, but you can't have it so short that there's nothing to solder to, and you also don't want that much wire, because then you just have way too much. What you'll end up, especially on some connectors with, is if I am soldered to this tab, I still have that much wire kicking out. So you're going to end up with something like that. And you definitely don't want that. That's how things short out. So we want just the right amount stripped. And the next thing we're going to do then is this little bit that we've stripped, we're going to do something called tinning. Now, what tinning is taking this bare wire, we're going to hold it with something, our helping hands here in this case. Iron is hot. Very first thing we want to do always, every time you pick up the iron, clean it. Keep that clean. And then the second thing you want to do is throw a little bit of new solder on there. That will help to distribute heat. Now we're going to tin this wire. What that means is we're going to kind of coat the end here in solder. On wire specifically, I say coat, but what I mean is you kind of want the strands of the wire saturated as well. So I'm going to take this iron that has some solder on it, kind of hold it here. It'll start to transfer some of the heat here into the wire. And then I'm going to start feeding my solder. Go kind of next to the iron at first to help get it started, and then kind of feed it into the wire itself. You want to get all around, and you want to keep going until you can tell that the strands of the wire are kind of saturated. Knock off some excess if you need to. And then if you just kind of hold your iron at the end here, it'll kind of make it soak into the wire a little bit more, kind of clean it up. And then keep going. And once you get that good and tinned, we clean our iron one more time, and we take a look at that. It should look like this. You can see that you're no longer seeing these individual strands of wire. It's all one solid thing here. And then we're going to do the same thing on the other end that we are soldering to. So in this case, with a Traxxas connector, it is this little tab. Now, we were talking about the difference between Traxxas connectors, the old style and the new style ID connectors, and they are backwards compatible. They're largely the same thing. But Traxxas no longer sells this style connector. In fact, they no longer sell female connectors at all. So the only way to get a Traxxas connector that isn't on a Traxxas battery basically is to buy a knockoff one. These are our house brand here. There are many companies who do Traxxas connectors, or Traxxas style connectors, I suppose they would call them. They're largely the same with a little bit of difference. If you have kicking around somehow from many years ago one of the Traxxas branded female connectors, it will come with tabs that say A or B. And Traxxas actually had a different tab for their male connector versus their female connector. Pretty much every aftermarket version of it that I've seen has a single tab that you solder to one side for the female or the other for the male connector. This is a female connector, so I want to make sure I solder to that side. On the ProStar connectors, it has writing here. It says HI with an S here. That's the side that you want to solder to for the female connector. and the blank side you would solder to for the male. I know Progressive does some of these. Those have a circle on one side that you're soldering to the circle side for the female and the blank side for the male. Again, on the ProStar, just pay attention to the writing, solder to the writing for the male. Same thing here. I usually solder straight onto my bench. I don't love the idea of doing that here because we are in the little studio space here. We just put this here, so I'm going to cheat and set it right on my iron here. I don't see a problem with that, rather than going and finding some kind of a mat or anything like that. You can also just put this in the helping hands, but on something small like this and metal, this takes some of the heat away, and I just don't know that it's super necessary. So here, again, we're going to clean the iron off, put a little bit of solder on our iron, and we're just going to gently touch the iron to the end of the tab, and just a little blob of solder on there. We just kind of want to coat it, clean our iron, and this is tinned just like the wire. This will be warm now. And it is cooler now. There's some water on my sponge here, if I didn't mention that. Oh, maybe I don't want to do it on that. Maybe don't do it on the iron. Find something that will not melt to set your stuff on, or put it into the helping hands here. Now that both are tinned, I am going to grab the helping hands. I am going to, again, clean my iron, put a little bit of solder on there. Now I'm going to touch here. This starts melting. I'm just going to set it on there, and you can kind of see, oops, I'll hold your hands steady. They will melt together. And you're good to go. I always want to tug on them a little bit just to make sure that it's solid. And now this will slide into the Traxxas housing and just pops in there. Then you do the other side. With this connector, you want to be conscious of your polarity. So your red wire, you're going to go to the positive marking here, black to the negative. If for some reason you're using a different color wire here, just pay attention to what your actual polarity is on the battery or the ESC or whatever you're soldering to. With Traxxas connectors in particular, there is a little rounded part here with a little bit of extra room for the wire to kind of fit in the housing, if you can see that. And you want to make sure that in addition to getting your polarity right, you want to, if you're soldering to a battery, you want to make sure that the battery is in the right orientation, so that when you get everything soldered up, you don't have to, now that I'm snapping things into the housing to get my correct polarity, I don't want to have to be crossing the wires. I would have been better off starting with the battery upside down so that these line up right. And as soon as you attempt to solder a Traxxas connector, if that didn't make sense to you, it will. The next one we're going to do is a IC3. And this process will be exactly the same for an IC5 connector. I use both sides of my helping hands here just to make it go a little bit quicker. First, I will clean my iron. Then I will put some solder on my tip. Now I'm going to tin my wire. Get that kind of good and saturated. With enough on the end that some additional heat's not just going to make it soak down further into the wire. Clean my tip. Put a little bit of solder on the tip. Touch my tip to here to transfer heat onto the metal part. Be very careful with IC3s, IC5s, XT60s, XT90s, Deans, especially the smaller variants of any of those plugs, because applying heat to the metal part can sometimes melt the housing if you hold it there for too long, or if the temp on your iron is too hot. So I'm going to pretty briefly hold my iron there, touch my solder, and this is now coated, tinned, just as we did with the Traxxas one. Again, clean my iron, put some solder on my iron, and you can kind of see now here on this one that I am tinned, but it kind of soaked a lot of that solder down into the wire, if you can tell on the camera there. So I'm actually going to hit that one more time. And that'll just make it easier to for those to kind of fuse together without having to hold my iron there for very long. Now I'm going to touch that, kind of get that to start melting, and pretty immediately they will melt together. You'll see kind of a color change in the solder that will kind of indicate that it's went back to a solid form. And everything is still pretty hot, especially with these short pieces of wire that I'm using. The wire itself gets pretty hot. You may want to wear gloves or grab some pliers to hold your wire. That's nice. Or just have some callus, I guess. That works. Now, you might wonder what's going to go over this. Now, if I were actually soldering to a battery here, I'd be kind of screwed. I would have to undo this joint and redo that, because this little housing will snap over this when I'm all done. And there's no way to get that onto the wire if this was attached to a battery. So before you do this, you want to slide this little housing on an IC3 or IC5 over your bare wire and just kind of let that dangle. Now with something like a Deans, you have to do something similar but with heat shrink. This is also true of an XT60 or an XT90. You'll have a little piece of heat shrink tubing that will go over the wire first, and that will then slide up over your solder joint. But you have to be a little bit more conscious there, because as I said, the wire gets a little bit hot. So usually not working with a super short piece of wire, you want to have that as far down the wire as you can, so all that heat's not transferring down and shrinking that. You can sometimes stretch that back out after the fact and do all right, but just save yourself the headache and push it down. Be conscious of that. Here, I'm not super concerned. I was just showing the soldering of the joint, but you do want to make sure that the first thing you do is put this over the wire, or your heat shrink over the wire, then solder. But that is how you would solder a IC3, IC5, XT60, XT90, XT30, the IC2s, any connector kind of like this. Deans is basically the same. These are flat as opposed to little, concave kind of bullets, but same kind of a deal. And the last connector we have here is a bullet connector. This is a 5mm bullet connector, but the process is going to be the same whether you're working with a 5 or a 3.5 or a 4 or an 8 or whatever. Just kind of bear in mind that the bigger this is, the more heat you're going to have to transfer to heat this up. You may have to hold things for longer. You may have to turn temp on your iron up. We can also talk a little bit about the type of tip that you have on here. So if you look pretty closely, this is, I don't know how good we can see this, but you can see this is a chisel tip, they call it. Now this is a pretty small chisel tip as opposed to, well, this is the same. There are wider ones. There are also little pencil tips that are basically just a point. These are great for soldering really small things or to a circuit board or something like that. If you're soldering to wire, it can be nice to have a little bit more surface area with that chisel. That lets you transfer heat a little bit easier. But if you're using the biggest possible chisel, something like a very small connector is a little bit more difficult. And then with bullets, if you're soldering to a much smaller bullet, especially, or any bullet really, kind of be conscious of not letting your solder will kind of pool up in here and then spill out. And especially on something like a EC3 or a EC5, where that bullet then has to pop into a housing, if any of that solder spills out to the outside of this bullet connector, you can have some difficulty there. So I'll show you how to do one of these easy, and there's different methods for soldering bullets. Everyone does it a little bit differently, but this is how I would solder a bullet connector. If I wasn't in my little studio space, I would have a little jig that holds this a little bit nicer than the helping hands here, the little alligator clip, but this works just fine. And I will kind of do this at a little bit of an angle so you can maybe see a little bit better. But same as anything else, we are going to first clean off our iron. And put a little bit of solder on the tip here. And we're going to heat this up. Now I'm doing this on the inside of the bullet. Some bullets will have a little hole on the side of them that you can kind of put the tip of your iron through, and that makes it easier. This one, I'm just going right in the end and just kind of feeding solder in there. Now you can kind of force solder in there because it's melting on your iron and then just falling in there. But if you don't hold the iron there for long enough for the connector itself to actually heat up, it's not going to adhere well to the bullet itself. So make sure you're conscious of that. Sometimes you can get a bad joint in there because the solder is just kind of lightly tacked inside the bullet, and then that solder melts to your tinning on your wire, and so it seems like it's good, but then as soon as you go to use it, that little ball of solder is going to fall right out of your connector. Make sure that you're actually heating up the bullet pretty well. And again, clean off my iron. Grab one of my little wire scrubs here. Clean, a little bit of solder, tin my wire. Now with bullets, you can speed all of this along if you do it pretty quick. Make sure that you don't have to do this, but it's easier if you don't take a lot of time between tinning things and actually forming your joint. Everything's still warm at that point. And you can even kind of reheat this, get this melted, and make this a little bit easier to go in there. And that's just going to melt together in there. Put a little bit of heat to the outside, and there you could kind of feel it. I don't know how well you could see that on the camera, but you'll, with a bullet especially, you'll feel the joint kind of forming. Whereas with these, you can very much see it. Everything's kind of internal here. So you're waiting for that pressure to kind of subside, and you'll feel it kind of, the wire kind of step down into the connector. But then your bullet connector is successfully soldered to that wire. I'm going to quick cool this down here. Best thing to do is to let it sit and cool, but for video purposes, I cool it down so I can touch it, give it a good yank. And I like to do that with all of my connectors just to make sure I have a good joint there. Whenever you're soldering, another important thing to note is pay attention to polarity at all times. You don't want to solder anything backward. As a shop, we're almost exclusively soldering things for customers as opposed to our own stuff. And especially if that isn't new product that they just bought, sometimes you can see some wacky joints come in, some wacky things come in. I've seen customers bring in a connector, and I'll change that connector, being conscious of the wire color to make sure my polarity is right. And then afterwards, I remember one instance where I looked back further at the battery that they had brought in, and there was heat shrink up close to the battery itself, where somebody had actually spliced in another wire, and that was reverse polarity. So I had to reverse the polarity on the connector to opposite of what it should have been. You can run into weird things when you are dealing with used items, especially. So you buy something off Facebook Marketplace or something like that. Be especially conscious of any equipment you have that you're using that wasn't new or wasn't something that you did or somebody who knew what they were doing soldered. You can run into some weird stuff there, but just in general, always be conscious of polarity. Always be conscious of your joints being good, and you shouldn't have too much problem. When you're done, make sure that you turn off your iron. I did that when I cut the camera. You didn't see me do that, but that's a really, really important thing too. You don't want to leave that on. Not only does it draw a lot of power, but it can be a fire hazard. But if you follow all of the things that we kind of talked about today, you'll do just fine soldering. It's something that if you have the right tools, it's pretty easy. It'll just take a little bit of practice to get used to. It's really not a hard thing, and it's a super good skill to have. In the long run, if you find yourself doing a lot of soldering rather than taking it to us or whatever your local hobby shop may be and paying them a few bucks every time you need a connector soldered, learning it yourself is really helpful. And once you start doing it, you'll find even more projects where you can make use of the soldering tools that you have. So if you have any questions about soldering, you can give us a call. All of our numbers to all of our stores will be in the descriptions. You can shoot us an email, info@nankinhobby.com. Make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, follow us here on YouTube, follow us on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, all over the place. We've been doing some whatnot streams lately. You can find us all over the place. We'll answer any questions you have on any platform. Like the video, share it with your friends, and we'll catch you on the next one.